Hello and welcome to this webinar on the state of safety culture in utilities. It's fantastic to have everyone signed up for today and for your early release of the safety culture report that we'll be sharing. Also very excited to be sharing the panel here today with some really important guests here from CS Energy, Veolia and Unity Water, who I'll introduce in just a moment. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen. Before we launch into today's topic and we unpack the state of safety culture in utilities a little bit further, well, first of all, we'll just cover a little bit of housekeeping really quickly. So for those of you who are not familiar with Centres, our mission is to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better every day. And we do that through the application of psychology and neuroscience to help leaders and organisations understand their cultural drivers, develop leadership capability, and create team alignment around safety culture. We're using GoToWebinar for today's webinar, so you'll have a control panel up on your screen. I'll give you a quick explanation of how that control panel works. As you'll see in the top left-hand corner, there's a little orange arrow. That orange arrow helps you expand and collapse that control panel at any time. The webinar is muted throughout. However, if you have comments to make or questions to ask, please feel free to put them into the comments and questions section. We'll be collating that towards the end of the webinar, and we'll do our best to respond to all comments and questions that are put up. The webinar is recorded and you will be sent a copy of the recording as well as all the associated resources post the webinar. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, anyone attending this webinar has early access to our latest ebook, The State of Safety Culture in Utilities. So we really encourage you to go into that control panel now, download that resource, and it provides some fantastic insights into the state of safety culture in utilities. So the purpose of today's webinar with the esteemed gentlemen on the panel is to really explore and drill down into the details and the specifics of some of the highlights that we found within the report. But before we go into too much detail about that, I'll quickly introduce everyone on the panel. So of course, as you're aware, my name is Anthony Gibbs and I'm the CEO of Centres. I'm joined by Andrew Vivardi here. Andrew Vivardi is the Executive General Manager of Corporate Services at CS Energy. Andrew Vivardi leads CS Energy's corporate functions, including human resources, organisational development, industrial relations, legal, risk assurance, board secretary, and corporate affairs. As an experienced energy and resources executive with over 15 years in the industry and 15 years in executive leadership roles, Andrew focuses on safely delivering high-value business outcomes. Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We've also got Clint Thiel here sitting next to me. He's the Head of Safety, Health, Environment and Quality at Veolia, Australia and New Zealand. Clint has worked across Australia and internationally in multiple sectors, including waste management and recycling, contaminated site investigation and remediation, utilities operation and maintenance, and mining. He's a qualified environmental engineer that spent his first half of his career in operations and has since transitioned to functional support where he can have a broader organisational impact. Since joining Veolia, he's built and embedded their life-saving rules and the do's and don'ts across Veolia's Australia and New Zealand operations, which have since been adopted more broadly. In fact, been rolled out globally through Europe, Asia and the Americas. So thank you, Clint.
Thanks, Anthony.
And finally, we've got, but last but not least, is Keenan. So Keenan is the Executive Manager of People, Culture and Safety at Unity Water. As Executive Manager, People, Culture and Safety for Unity Water, Keenan has more than 25 years experience in human resources and workplace health and safety in both the public and private sectors. He has held senior management positions in national and international organisations in the industrial services, engineering and logistics sectors. So thank you, Keenan, and thank you, gentlemen, again for joining us.
Thanks, Anthony.
So we're going to launch into some of the real highlights that we found within the report, and of course you've all had a chance to review those beforehand. But before we launch into those, I'll just provide all our listeners and viewers with a little bit of context about the data. So the data draws on about 6,889 respondents who participated in online safety culture surveys to share their perceptions of safety culture at work. To assure that no organisation was overrepresented, what we've done is we've stratified that data down to a sample group of 3,409 respondents. So that means that all those different organisations that were surveyed have an equal representation. So the survey was targeted at a wide variety of utilities and subsectors, and this included workers at all levels, including frontline, supervisor and management. It also looked at a cross-section of demographics and a whole range of different factors within the utility sector. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare utilities with our broader sample group of over 20,000 respondents from across 47 companies in 11 industries. So the industries include things like agriculture, aquaculture, construction, education, government, healthcare, industrial services, manufacturing, oil and gas, and utilities. So quite a broad spread. Just keep my slides up with things. So we're sharing that broad spread of data with you today. To help you understand the insights that the report provides, we'll give you a little insight into how the scoring is put together. So you'll see that there'll be green scores, orange scores, and red scores. So green represents positive, orange represents fair, and red represents negative. So in order for any organisation to score green in any section, they need to score either a 6 or a 7. So that would mean they would have either agreed or strongly agreed. At fair, it's a slightly agree, and below that is seen as a negative perception. So what we did is we had a look at those perceptions across the entire safety culture model. So people, practices, environment, and of course leadership. So it's a really broad sweeping understanding of that organisational culture. So the key highlights, the first key highlight that I want to draw our attention to, focuses on how the utilities stack up overall when it comes to cultural performance. And as we can see here, they sit at about the benchmark level, maybe slightly below when it comes to those negative perceptions around culture. In regards to underreporting, very similar sorts of scores, maybe slightly higher underreporting, but much better production pressure scores. So just to unpack what we mean by underreporting and production pressure, underreporting refers to the amount of incidents or errors that go underreported or unreported by employees on a day-to-day basis. And this could be anyone from the C-suite all the way down to the floor. So we measured that by asking people how many incidents or errors they'd been involved in over the last 12 months and how many they'd reported. We basically did some simple maths to look at the difference. In regards to the production pressure, what we looked to do was unpack how much people felt pressure to prioritise production over safety. So as you can see there within the utilities overall, not such a huge opportunity area. But if we look on the right-hand side here, what we want to unpack in a little bit more detail is some really interesting demographic insights. So you can see at the top here that the underreporting rate for people who'd been in the industry for less than a year was at 31%. So right in that red zone. And from an age perspective, people in the 29 years and under bracket were the most likely to underreport, and they were most likely to experience production pressure. So Andrew, I'm going to direct this first question towards you. In your experience, is increased pressure and reluctance to report incidents more prevalent in younger workers?
Look, I think the stats suggest that it is. I guess when I looked at these, I was quite disappointed that those were the results. So I think there's a fair bit of work to go. Look, I think if you look at induction programs, is your first opportunity to, I guess, start embedding what you want to see in those new starters. Perhaps we're not where we need to be as an industry. So I think that's a contributing factor. Also, the mentoring and leadership obviously plays a role in those teams as people come on. And we'll talk about the younger generation, but they tend to want to do things to prove themselves to the older workforce. And there's always a potential there that they don't take on board what we would like them to do, but more importantly, perhaps we're not doing enough to make sure they take them on board. So
So perhaps a challenge from both directions in individuals wanting to prove themselves, push their career forward, show that they're doing the best possible job, but at the same time looking at the organisational responsibility to set the right frame for people, induct them in the right way, perhaps look at the partnering perspectives as well. How about, gentlemen, any other perspectives on that youth worker?
Oh, look, it was a bit surprising, like Andrew said, for me as well, looking at the data. In terms of the Unity Water experience, one of the things that we have seen with the sort of the younger cohort that we're trying to actively bring into the organisation is that they do tend to, in our perception is they bring a fair bit of energy, and they also have been willing to challenge the status quo a fair bit. And so, but that is probably drawn from our white collar sort of professional areas in the organisation. I think that when they go out into the field operational areas, then there's potentially, they're more influenced by the work units that they're working with, that sort of thing. And if there is a general, sort of practice of not necessarily reporting, then that might be the custom that they learn in the workplace. And secondly, that they might not feel that psychological safety to be able to say, to someone else who's one of their teammates or peers who's a bit more experienced, do you think we should have reported that, or to challenge that sort of behaviour? So I can see why that would then start to become, a practice.
Absolutely. Look, really interesting insight. So it sounds like there's an opportunity for us to think really deliberately about the way we induct people and set them up for success when they come into an organisation.
Yeah. I think setting that expectation with the younger workforce as they join, because they will come in not wanting to create waves.
Yeah, good point.
So just going with the flow, trying to impress their new supervisor and admitting that they've got something wrong, potentially puts them in a vulnerable position. So setting the expectation early as they come on board and hey, it's okay to stop the job and let me know about anything that's wrong. Will, I guess, set them up for success moving forward.
Yeah, great.
There's also the opportunity of whether the systems that are in place are actually supporting the reporting of that younger generation, right?
Yeah.
So perhaps we need to move on and from what we've done in the last decade or whatever to something that's a little bit more streamlined and maybe technologically based. So, but it's important to get that and ask them for that feedback along the way.
Yeah. So potentially even opportunities come out of that younger generation coming through to adopt new technology and that provides that better reporting.
I think that's a good point. And just further to Clint's point, I think one of the things you might consider actively is around who those team members are placed with. So who are the mentors and leaders that they're, actually, coupled with when they first start in the organisation, and trying to give them those individuals who, have track records of positive reporting and positive influence on, incident reporting and safety behaviours and the like. That's another opportunity.
Awesome. So some really good tips there. To dig into some other highlights that we found in the report, the next really bit of really interesting bit of insight that we found was around the approach to incident investigation. So we can see you've got the industry benchmark and you've got the utilities benchmark there as well, which unfortunately is sitting predominantly in that red zone. So if we unpack those particular items a little bit more, you've got incident investigations are conducted to identify all causes, example tools and systems, rather than only blame specific people for doing something wrong. Incident investigations are done in a way that is fair to all people involved. And the purpose of incident investigations is to help employees learn and grow from their mistakes. So generally negative perceptions around those types of comments. So Keenan, I'm curious to hear from your perspective. What is this poor perception of incident investigation based on, and what can we do to start to address it?
Look, I think just speaking from our experience at Unity Water, so one of the things is, if you look at the model you guys have put up with Centus, Anthony, we have predominantly focused very much on the practices and the environment, right? And didn't necessarily, have an active, view to try and influence the people side for, a number of years. So we would have thought that we've invested quite a bit in having, we have good processes to, follow through on incidents, do debriefings, capture the information and record it. So what we weren't seeing out of that is potentially the change that we would like to influence, or work practices that would sort of go back to, what they were before. And particularly people, potentially being complacent, rushing, that sort of stuff. So for us, I think it's looking at incidents in the wider cultural context of the organisation. So you can have all the systems and processes to gather everything, but it's actually how you conduct those reviews and what do you do with that information. And so we did have a bit of an approach for a number of years early on in the organisation of, probably, the word probably punishing is probably a bit apt, people who did the wrong thing. right? So in our eyes. So therefore there was this negative perception that was created about safety incident investigations. So people would say, look, I don't want to really tell everyone what happened because I don't want to admit that anything went wrong because I've seen what happened to Joe when he did that, right? So that started the organisation off potentially on the wrong sort of course initially. So what we've found is, and that then breeds, you don't get all the information you need, people don't have confidence in the outcomes, and you're missing opportunities to, identify other risks and take them out of the organisation. So we have found that we've had to really work hard on the cultural side of the business about how we engage with our team when things go wrong, and really working on that, that fear and blame side of it. So for me, you can have the slickest process, but you're not going to get the real identification of risks or practices that need to change or behaviours if people are fearful of the outcome.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you for sharing your experience and your insights. And I think many other utilities are experiencing some similar challenges. I mean, it's just Clint, you probably get to canvass a number of different operational sites with Veolia. As a running contracting crews coming in and looking after things from that lens, what's your experience of incident investigations from a contractor perspective?
It's a whole bunch of different scenarios play out in this situation. So generally, what you'll find is in some organisations, there's the trick or the trip that someone could follow around a quick win with a board to say contractor's fault. Right. Incident's done. We've wrapped it up. We've gone and sacked the contractor or whatever. Move on really quickly, which obviously brings in the underlying issue of you never find the root cause. Of the underlying concern. So what we've found work really well is when we go side by side with our customers. With the utilities operators, hit joined at the hip, and work through the investigation together to get to the root cause. And set out the terms of reference up front. So it's very, very clear that it's not about finding the person that went wrong. We need to find out where it went wrong within either the contract structure, the organisational structure, because generally that's where it has failed. And then have the commitment from both organisations to come together to make sure that we learn the same, because generally our customers have their workforce that are exposed to exactly the same risks, and we want to have that learning partnership with our customers, just as they would be exposed to incidents and have them share them with us, as we sort of maybe coming to a network that we're not as experienced in.
Yeah, great. Interesting. Well, yes. Andrew, anything to add to that?
I think communication is really critical. So you might find what the root cause is, but I think if you don't communicate it effectively, then as we all know, the actual root cause will be made up by the workforce, and that's probably not necessarily helpful. So I think in putting from a contractor position, I think the businesses need to take accountability for contractors and treat them no differently to their employees. And that communication in that instance is also incredibly important. So if you don't communicate those findings, which you do have as a consequence of your investigations, then you are missing the opportunity to actually make a
really
difference.
good point.
And as Keenan highlighted before, if trust is broken through that process and blame is created, then it has ramifications and it does have blowback impacts on things like your reporting culture and alike as well. Good segue, I guess, with the contractor conversation is into, I guess, one of the other highlight areas, which was around contractor management. So you can see some really interesting data up on the screen right now. So I'm going to go up to the top right-hand side here, which talks about the alignment piece and that being joined at the hip here. Clint, so you've got, the attitude and behaviour of contractors on site are consistent with the company's safety, vision and values. So that's a potential gap area. You then roll down to the bottom right-hand corner. Company leadership and contractor leadership work together effectively to ensure safety is a priority. So a bit reflective of what you were talking about there as well. Over to the left there, talks to the inductions and training of contractors. And then down the bottom left-hand side, when a safety issue comes up on site, contractors are not automatically blamed by permanent employees for the source of the problem. So some quite challenging data there, I think, for us to digest, given the fact that contracting workforces for the utility sector seem to become more and more of of a prevalent piece. So having set that context, Clint, from the perspective of a contractor to the industry, is this an us versus them culture that we're seeing play out there? And what do you typically see as the drivers of these sorts of results?
Well, I think the probably the first word of caution is the label of a contractor.
Yes.
Right, so you're rolling in every layer of contractors, everyone from a tier 1 down to a sole operator, and everyone in between. They will all have very different sort of value propositions and priorities and an attitude towards safety. And so we need to be careful around, I guess, that label, because someone's experience with, say, a lower level contractor, maybe that's been assigned to a task that is outside of their risk profile. So they don't really know what they're doing.
That's a good point.
And so you get that that wrap up, because it's easy to put them in that box, right? So I guess that's the first word of caution. The other element is around, for me, is about making sure that whatever service that you're engaging, that you've really assessed what type of contractor and what sort of partnership you want to have to get that end result. So if it's a really high risk, complex service delivery, you probably don't want to have a sole operator doing that task. But if they're going and doing, I don't know, test and tag or something like that, then maybe it's a low risk task. That's where you would leverage those sorts of contracts. The type of contracts are also really important. So in terms of the drivers that sort of sit behind, in terms of what does that performance look like, and really promoting the client contractor relationship, that it's not just a put, you guys go and deliver. Again, you want that sort of joined at the hip solution.
So more of a partnership kind of
absolutely
mindset.
And then to the last point I was going to talk about was that we're coming back to the investigation element. So the us and them part comes when generally stuff goes wrong. So when a contract's running well and jobs are getting done and there's no issues, everyone's really happy. But when something goes wrong, then that's when the fingers come out and then there's the pointing. And that's where I think it's really important to make sure that there's that maturity within the relationship to ensure that the investigations are getting to the root causes so that everyone learns. And some really good examples of that are playing out in the industry right now. And I guess if we can have more of that, we'll have less of the us and them, because generally we wear a different coloured shirt, you're not on the site the whole time, you becomes more of the label as opposed to, Steve and Mary and Jane and Bob, who are the guys who are coming to deliver that service for our project. Dehumanises it.
So what I'm hearing is it's about getting the right contractor or the right service provider for the right task, and obviously got a high risk. You need to make sure that you've got people that are matched to that. The way that contracts are set up is important. So how KPIs are established to make sure that it facilitates positive outcomes, and then lastly the relationship between the different leadership groups to work out, because again, to your point, it's easy to get along with someone when everything's going to plan, but it's often when the things hit the fan that the relationship is really tested.
Exactly. And I guess, and we're in a unique position, or somewhat unique, in that we engage subcontractors as well. And so whilst we are a contractor to many of our clients, we also engage in contractors to help deliver whatever their subject matter expert service may be.
Great.
Very interesting.
And I mean, obviously from CS and Unity Water, I assume you've got a fairly broad contractor pool on site?
Very much so. I think, look, a couple of things that Clint said resonate a lot. I think the thing that is making the biggest change at Unity Water is that we've changed our perspective, like you said, about contractors, right? So it's about what sort of capabilities do we need to deploy to basically achieve our strategic plan and its objectives. And so looking at those partnerships, that is basically a set of capabilities that we're bringing into the organisation. So I think the biggest change for us is in terms of how we can integrate those partners into our business and see them as part of our standard operating processes and methods, so they're not different in that respect. Right now, clearly, the levels of accountability that the partner might have versus our team in certain situations will be different, and the type of work methods they follow and all that will be, potentially different. But the key for us is getting that onboarding right. So what's the balance? So if you've got someone who's dropping in, for a day to do a small discrete piece of work, you might want to say, okay, their induction process and onboarding is very limited versus someone who's going to be here for a long time. But we've actually changed that view to say, okay, it might be a small discrete piece of work, but if it's high risk, then the involvement needs to be higher, right?
Yep.
So that's one thing, is just looking at that partnership model. The things you said, Anthony and Clint, about shared accountabilities, getting those really clear up front, but also in a constructive way, because ultimately, service providers to your organisation are asked to tender on safety, performance and things like that, and that can immediately create this potential for divide, because if there's not that really constructive, clear two-way communication about how each other is performing, then that can affect the relationship and how well they perform, but also they might be worried about it's going to affect their future work. So you've got to, all those sorts of things need to be worked through. And again, it just really, to me, comes down to the leadership of the internal person who's working with that service provider to leverage their capability. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, so that maturity of that relationship, respecting what that contractor can bring, and approaching the work as an equal as opposed to that parent-child potential dynamic.
I think that's a really good point. The thing for me is scope. You've got to know what they're actually coming in to do. But more importantly, I think we, as an industry, tend to think that contractors don't know safety as well as we do. And I'd like to challenge that, because there's many instances where I think we can learn. If we want to be a learning organisation or a learning industry, we should be asking guys like Clint, well, tell us what you've seen on other sites.
Yes.
So that actually is a really good thing to do up front, and it's all the decisions you make up front really are the ones that are then going to reflect through how your contract's
absolutely.
running. So
planning.
Front end work's really important, scope, and then obviously not thinking that we all know everything. Because we don't, otherwise we wouldn't be having incidents, right? So
It's a
a
great
very
call.
different frame, isn't it? How can we learn as opposed to tell?
Yeah, that's a great point.
And it's interesting that that part about, so in a past part of my career, where I sat in the client's chair, it was very much that anecdotal. The contractors were having all the incidents, so that was just that was the message that got sent around. Whereas you look into the stats, and it's not the case. It's pretty much 50-50. So it comes down to that. It's not a contractor issue. It's not a. It becomes an organisational issue of where it's going wrong.
And if you live in our power stations, obviously in small towns, generally those contractors are locals. Why would we be happy that one of them have been injured as opposed to?
Yeah, really good point.
Doesn't make sense. So care and concern piece up front, as well as I said, that scoping and understanding what they can do is really important.
Yeah. No, it is a really good point, and it extends also to, if you think about contingent, team members as well. Like in a lot of parts of Unity Water, we might have, people, usually term labour hire type, team members who are coming in, and they're effectively operating under our supervision on our sites, that sort of stuff. So again, it's just seeing that as just an extension of your team, that there's no difference there.
Yeah.
So I think that's another thing. Look, and I would say we're nowhere near where we need to be, right? I think it's important to acknowledge that we want to create a much more integrated approach. Our capital delivery team, where a lot of our contracting base is, and the executive that leads that, Amanda Creevy, they're doing a fantastic job of really taking ownership. And so they've created these mechanisms for contractors to, as Andrew and Clint were saying, share their experiences so we can learn from them, and that there is a commitment that the group's made to a shared safety charter, basically, that they're, of certain standards that they want to mirror in how they interact with each other.
That's great. So some really useful insights there. I guess the theme that I'm hearing coming through is for the change to occur and for us to address some of these opportunity areas, it really does sit with leadership to start to create that change, which again, if we dig a little bit further into the data, there's some highlight opportunities here as well. So what we've got on the screen now is the perceived management commitment to safety, and again, it tells a really interesting story for utilities, I think. And the story is that there seems to be a bit of a divide in place. So we've got the senior management perceived in a particular way, and then it feels a little bit like direct leaders and supervisors are are quite connected with their workforce, and they're perceived as caring more. So, interesting data here around perceptions that senior site manager doesn't truly understand the impact of safety. Senior site management doesn't spend enough time out in the field understanding issues. Again, that real sense of a divide. I'm curious on your take on that data and why that might be in place and what we can do about it.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start off if you like. So I think the visible leadership element from our senior leaders is key. Right?
Yep.
So, and I think we all agree on that. For me, it's I sort of see that like the frontline leaders, generally it's their first leadership gig. So they've stepped up from the field, or they've shown some sort of promise, and they've moved up into some sort of supervisory leadership role. And so they will mirror what they're seeing their middle managers or their direct managers do, and those middle managers are mirroring what the CEO's doing.
Yep.
So there's all this mirroring of what good looks like on the way up. So that's why it's really important to set some expectations around that field visibility within that middle management and senior management, because what interests them fascinates me as a supervisor, and so you generate more engagement. So when we've gone down the path of establishing some KPIs for our leadership around field time, we call it always safe interactions, whereby they're in the field having real risk-based, task-based discussions with the front line.
Okay.
And the feedback is it's been outstanding.
Yeah, right.
Yep.
So getting out there and the senior leaders actively role modelling the behaviours they want to see from all parts of the organisation, and obviously having very clear conversations that are asking questions and exploring concepts further.
Exactly, and also promoting those expectations around stopping the job and living our life-saving rules and making the right decisions when that senior manager's not there.
Yeah.
Because generally in that utility space, those workers are by themselves. So they're in a small crew, or they may even be a sole operator, and there's no supervisor there watching. So they need to make the right choice. And so it's about setting those expectations through that visible leadership.
Great.
Yeah, I think, Anthony, I think trust is really important. So if you look at building those relationships, the absence of trust means that you're not going to be able to build them. So you have to get out, you have to go and have conversations. I think it's important to ensure you're listening rather than asking lots of questions, because you can actually learn a lot from what people tell you as opposed to asking the questions that you want answers to. So, and look, it's quite challenging. I'm obviously working in corporate office. Going to sites unusual in terms of there's lots of risks out there that I can see. There's lots that I can't see.
Yes.
But I think going out and doing walkarounds with people that know what they're doing, it's a really good way of creating that I guess relationship at the level that you need to, and also building that trust.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is important that Clint highlighted is that role modelling, and also if you're tying it back to the incident investigations and the learning organisation, we learn from incidents, but we also learn from going out and having conversations. And so if you can learn something from that, take it back, and if there's something that you need to do out of that, if there's a conversation that, look, I'll get that sorted out, make sure you do it.
Yeah.
And also communicate back. So I tend to send an email if I've had an interaction or walk around with someone and said, thanks for that, I'll learn something, or alternatively, here, catch up again next time.
So making the conversations human and real is what I'm hearing there. So, and look, it's a trap that we'll often see, is that we'll be given a form to complete on site. We'll go outside and the leader will be so focused on making sure they ask the questions on the form and tick the right boxes, they completely forget the person that they're talking to. So, building that relationship and taking that humanistic approach is, again, another component I'm hearing to the role modelling. Now, I'm curious, because, this is not uncommon feedback for leaders to receive, that, there's a gap. And I rarely get a senior management team that says to me that they don't spend a bunch of time in the field. How much time is the right amount of time? What's reasonable, and what's going to make the change?
Look, again, I think it depends on the context of the organisation and the type of work that's being performed. I think that, that visibility is critical. So I think the other thing is just in terms of trying to put what would be a suggested or arbitrary time. I think that would be a bit of a stab in the dark from my perspective, right? So, people make personal commitments to do stuff. So, might be that you try to be out on a field visit, or, looking at different risks in the field. Because I do think, to Anthony's point, that's, we can see some risks but not others. I think it's important to actually hear from people who experience those risks all the time. And I think that was one of the things that came through the data, people being able to have input into what will make them safe, right? So I think having an arbitrary time is a bit hard. I think you should spend definitely time. I might say, like for me, I try and get out once a month or whatever. It might be twice a month, then some months it's more than that. So, but I think it's what you do with the information, right? So for me, just personally, I think that there is always going to be a natural gravitation between the work team and the supervisor, because they're there every day together, right? So they have a shared experience that we don't necessarily have with them. So the key is when we are senior management is interacting with site leaders or teams, to all the points Clint and Anthony picked up around listening, but to me it's also what you actually tangibly doing something with the suggestion, so they feel like they have some involvement and influence. And to me that helps to shift that perception that we're listened to and that we can actually influence safe, like what makes us safe in the organisation, right? So in Unity Water, we've had a bit of a focus on this concept, we call our say-do gap, right? So what we say we're going to do, but what we actually do, when there's a divergence, it creates people to basically not think we're serious, and to also, as Andrew just said, not trust us. Right. So to me, what I'm getting point is that when we interact, regardless of the amount of time, if you genuinely try to place the team member, whether it be a supervisor or a team member, in the position of the expert, to allow them to draw out and tell you what they think is their risks and what makes them safe, and then you actually follow through and do something about that, that to me is very powerful and is more important than the amount of time you might spend out there. So I think that's something that's important.
Getting that quality of information circling back is really important. And actually, Matthew has just sent through a question online, which I think probably ties nicely into this idea of how we spend our time in field. So what he's asked is, does anyone present feel they've got reporting structures in place to identify what he's called bright spots? So people doing the right thing within the frontline delivery of work. And if so, what do they do in identifying his key behaviours and linking them to positive outcomes? So I guess from a centre's perspective, we call that hunting the good stuff. But I think it's a really good question from Matthew. Anyone like to comment on that one?
Yeah, I'd say we're in our infancy. We've certainly introduced a bright spot site, actually called Bright Spot. So
is it right?
Matthew's on the mark there.
Did you come up with that yourself? Or?
But to our Exco.
Yeah, right.
So a monthly Exco will get their CQ report. Slide in there is on the bright spot. So my team have gone through and built it and identified where have we found something that's really stands out. Escalate that to Exco. Exco will then make the call back to that site or that person and give them feedback about saying thank you. So it's getting that feedback loop back into ops so that they know to share the really good stuff. And there's so much good stuff that happens every day. But generally in that safety space, you're focused on the stuff that's gone wrong and you're in that reactive space. So it's flipping it to try to let's replicate all the really good stuff that's happening.
So it's early days. I'm just curious, have you seen any positive benefits of that?
Certainly the feedback from the crews who are doing it, and then the wanting to share more of it. Yeah, it's great.
Great. How about yourself, Andrew or Keenan? Any success in that space?
Yeah, look, I think again, like Clint, we're in our infancy. As you know, Anthony, we're working, on a program to bring the practice environment and people components together more holistically. We've certainly looking at how we can capture that good stuff. So for me, there's like a kudos program that we run around safety, which calls out and individuals can instantly recognise things that are done well. We also are gathering that information and recognising it at board and executive level and with teams across the organisation. So to focus on people who have done something that we think is all the elements were there to be ticked that they did really, well. It's interesting, it was about probably, I reckon, even 5 years ago that I saw a presentation from a safety safety executive from Tees Mining, and they were basically talking about how so much focus is on what goes wrong and incident evaluation and then learning from that. They'd actually flipped it on its head, and they were working through this process of when they had any project or any activity, what went right, and they were actually taking a more positive frame to say, okay, these were the 10 things that worked really well in this process, and if we replicate those all the time, those 10 things are good and keep people safe. And so for us, it's about how do we start to reinforce that replication of the positive outcome, because it is like we naturally skew to the bit that goes wrong. So I think that's an excellent question, and it's something that I think we're on, like Clint's team, we're on a journey, but we've got to get better at it.
Yeah. Great.
We've been doing it for a while. I think one of our learnings is the informality really makes a difference. So I guess we're all familiar with safety shares. You highlight the risks of the day's work, but introducing a positive safety share, what we're calling a people share, because we actually use safety culture and I guess the broader culture as examples. So recognising individuals within teams on an informal basis at the beginning of the day or at the beginning of a meeting for work they've done does help. We've had some feedback in the last sort of 12 to 24 months that individual recognition is also not that, welcomed at times. So from an Australian cultural perspective, it's sort of like a tall poppy. So we're still recognising where we can the individuals, but more importantly focusing on teams. And we're also using the example of taking it through to relevant board committees and the board as well, which is again a little bit awkward at times for people, but it's important because that then reinforces that that's the behaviours that we want to see on site. So interesting, the Australian sort of cultural.
Isn't it? Yeah. So I mean, how you give that positive feedback is so important. Yeah. And at the same time, I think it's a really important topic, because if the only time you hear from safety is when something goes wrong, that's what creates the unhelpful frame, the unhelpful brand. Yeah. So building that positive recognition of what's working is so important.
Yeah. And again, it's not intended, Anthony, as you say, like like organisations, like we've approached things, lessons learned, all that was all intended to help the organisation, but it's just that the way, as Andrew and Clint said, how it's communicated, like, how thinking about how this would make people feel about it, even when you get individuals who, where you try to say, okay, if things went wrong, you share those learnings across the organisation with others, doesn't always have the outcome that you intend it to have. I think to your point, Andrew, about, people are not always comfortable with that,
Well, it's human nature to an extent, right? Like if we're driving home after this webinar, we could probably have someone let us merge into a lane and give way to us, and then as soon as someone cuts us off, that'll be what hijacks the entire trip. Yes. So it needs to be a really deliberate, conscious decision, doesn't it, when we're going out to hunt the good stuff. The right culture can change the art of what's possible in organisations. So, and we're seeing a lot of really progressive organisations, like many of the ones that you folks are part of leading, using safety as a lever for change within organisations, a way of demonstrating positive care and commitment to the workforce, which is absolutely fantastic. I'm curious what, with everything that's happened with COVID and, coming out of COVID, hopefully I haven't jinxed everyone. What are your focuses for the next 12 months in terms of your safety culture development process? I'll start with you, Andrew, if you don't mind.
Oh, look, we've obviously worked with you guys in terms of from a wellbeing perspective, particularly around resilience. So when we went into lockdown last year, it became apparent that we wanted to ensure that our people were ready to bounce back whenever they needed to. So we've been running a program probably since about August last year now, which is dedicated at focusing on building people's resilience, and it's something that everyone can benefit from, and more importantly their families as well. So that's been a focus for us, and that'll continue because it actually underpins a lot of the other, psychological safety that we're trying to embed in the business, which then is a bit of a beachhead for other work that we're doing. So inclusion and diversity and broader cultural metrics. So I think that's going to be our key focus, and I guess in terms of the ongoing when we look at those statistics, we can't ever stop and say, actually,
No.
we're doing okay there, now we'll just let that go. So I think that maintenance is really critical. So our code program, which is a co-developed program with Centus, I'm just getting a plug in there for you, is actually,
Take it any day,
from a
Andrew, thank
safety
you.
perspective, has been incredibly valuable to our business, but more importantly, the broader cultural piece, because we've been doing for some time 2 lots of measurements through the Centre's safety
Yes.
culture metric, and also a broader human synergistic one, and they're a really good parallel. So that'll be our focus, to continue that maintenance as we face into some really difficult times for a coal-fired generator. So,
Yeah, no, really good point. So we're similar to what Andrew was just talking about, as you know, Anthony, and we're probably earlier in the journey is what I would say. So again, continuing the program, around basically shaping that culture in the organisation. So like CS Energy and Andrew's team, we're working with you around how do we make safety the catalyst for a broader, more constructive culture in the organisation. And the idea is if we can create that psychological safety and that positive frame around safety and people taking personal accountability for their actions, then that will help have more constructive interactions across the organisation. So we're obviously keeping that going. We're basically trying to make sure that frame is put around all of the learning that we get from activities in the business. So call them incident outcomes, things of that nature, debriefing. So how do we continue just to really reinforce that that basically psychological safety, to call out all the things that people feel could be done differently, but to extend beyond that and actually involve the team members more in the actual outcome or action, right? So to get the people really involved in that, because I think that's way that we can sort of break down this frontline leadership divide a bit. Is interestingly, I had the opportunity, we're talking with Shane Webke as a Queensland Safety Ambassador, and he, talked about the fact that ultimately you've got to have standards in a workplace, but the best way is obviously getting your team, to create those standards, because then there's more of a commitment to maintaining them. So that's a really positive thing that we're looking at there. And, and we're doing all the other stuff that everyone else is around, considering how do we take the things that we learnt during COVID that were good experiences for our people, and how do we continue to replicate those across the business in the long run. Also, how do we make sure we've got the right sort of safety framework around remote working, that is there anything in that space that we need to, when it was a quick stand up in a health emergency, and then it might be an episodic thing versus a long-term sustained arrangement. So we're just having a look at the footing on that front as well. And then like I'm sure Clint and Andrew, how do you manage an ever expanding and more complex safety management system effectively? Because it seems to be something new, whether it's silica dust or something coming out all the time. So we've got to, and so technology for us is probably the way that we see that being more manageable and more consumable to our frontline team, because they've got a lot of info coming down the pipe to them. The days of 30-page swims and all that sort of stuff, are gone, I think. So we've got to try and work that. How do we be efficient in that space?
So it sounds like the key vehicle to address a lot of that, though, is collaboration.
Yeah, correct.
And working together.
Trust, basically, creating that trust.
Yeah, great. Excellent. How about yourself, Clint?
Well, we're restarting after a year pause. So around this time last year, we essentially stopped our culture program. So we'd developed one and we were starting to roll it out, but actually COVID came and stopped all our interactions. So and I guess being a little bit unique in that we're across every state, territory, region across Australia and New Zealand, all the different shutdowns that stopped all the interactions and happening. So it was really difficult to navigate. So we've redesigned what our program looks like, and much like Keenan, we were saying around setting up the behaviours of what our expectations are of our workforce. So we call them our will and our will nots, and it's developed by the workforce. And now we tend to train them and roll them out so that expectation around making those decisions, go back to we review all our incidents and the poor behaviours are generally because we've made a poor decision somewhere along the lines, misinformed. So these very transparent behaviours then set the expectation for the leaders, the managers, and all of our workforce to work to the same goal.
Yeah, right.
So that's our clear focus for this year now.
Yeah,
redesigned program to be hopefully COVID safe in terms of shutdowns and border issues. Absolutely, we're in the same journey.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing. So we're going to move into the Q&A part of the session now. We did get a couple of people, however, email questions through beforehand, so we've got a very enthusiastic group down the line. Clint, I might kick off with you if you don't mind, first of all. Alan has asked, how do you influence an itinerant workforce when you only have them on site for a short period of time? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, good question. Setting the expectation very clearly and upfront around the way we work. So I just talked about our behaviours. So with our supervisors, if they're then that itinerant worker coming in for maybe a week, a day, whatever it might look like, certainly they'll have their inductions and they'll know the rules of how they're meant to work. But again, it's those decisions, can I stop the job if I'm uncomfortable with the way things are going? So absolutely upfront, setting that expectation around, what it is and how we're going to go about working in that crew, and then teaming them up with a buddy.
Yeah, right.
So that they get looked after through that journey. And again, depending on the risk that they're there for whatever task, that you've got someone there that's there to look after them and also challenge as well. So we expect that they would be saying, hey, I'm not comfortable. Can we have a discussion about doing this in a safer way?
Yeah, right. Okay, so again, it's probably coming back a little bit to some of the earlier conversation, being very planful and thoughtful about how we're going to approach that.
Exactly. I mean, they're not a commodity.
Yeah.
Right? So they're in there as part of the team, and we need to embrace them as part of that team and make sure they're looked after.
Great. I've had one just come through live now, and it's an interesting topic because it talks about the ever-evolving role of the safety team and the safety professional. So the question is, how do you see the safety team playing now and into the future in improving safety in your organisations?
Yeah, who would like?
I think that's a good one for Keenan.
Yeah, all right. So, look, to be like, and it is, I wonder if it's someone from Unity Water that sent that through, because it was one of the things that was called out in our first maturity assessment that we did, is around the role of the safety team, which was, there was, potentially a lack of clarity, as the organisation was changing. So look, for me, I think that the key thing is that there can't be the super people that are there on every job site, flying around, stopping things from falling over, stopping people, tripping over, all that sort of stuff. So for me, the key is it's about, they have a really important role in coaching and mentoring leaders to be effectively the safety leader for their functions, right? I think that is absolutely where that role is going into the future. Now, part of it is they have a role to play to influence learning content, right? So, what are things that we have to ensure our team are skilled in? So they've got a role to play in that, but ultimately that is that role around helping leaders to understand standards and practices and coaching them through that activity so they can deploy that to their own teams. Because I think that, and really being that cultural ambassador as well about that ownership. And then when they've got to get involved to help remediate things or to work through and debrief something that's happened, really playing that role of a positive facilitator so we can work through how we can do things differently, and drawing on the feedback from the people involved in the actual work who carry the risk. Yeah, so that's just my sort of general view.
So potentially a controversial question is, how equipped are our safety professionals to provide that level of support in general? Andrew, do you have a perspective on that one?
Look, I can't agree more with Ken in terms of that transition from a compliance focus, which I still think people tend to see the safety team as moving to a coaching. And look, I think everyone is on a development pathway.
Yes.
So I'm not going to be critical of health and safety professionals and say that they're not where they need to be, because I think safety in itself has evolved over the decades, right? So I think it's a natural evolution. I think certainly they're capable of making the transition. And I actually think they can be quite powerful in terms of how they affect that transition through that interaction because of the influence they have on the organisation.
Yeah,
so you're right, they get face time with leadership, they get face time with supervisors, and they get face time within the team.
Yes.
So, again, if the environment's created where there's psychological safety for the safety team to learn and develop and to show that actually we're moving and we're transitioning, then I'm sure that they'll be successful. Anything's possible. It just takes time, effort, and a bit of budget. And I don't think if you're coming from the right place, that budget's going to be an issue.
Good point, Andrew.
Great. We mentioned swims before. I think, Keenan, you mentioned swims and the role of a 30-page swims maybe ever declining. Michael's actually asked a question about that. So he's interested in the suitability of swims as a means of hazard management and control. As we balance regulatory requirements and everything like that. So where do you think things are heading in the swim space?
I don't know if Clint wants to.
Simplified. Right?
Yeah.
So the SWIMS is the formal document that, unfortunately, the regulator's always going to ask for a piece of evidence.
Yep.
So show me the document. So you need to have that. But it's there to facilitate the discussion with the work crew so that everyone's aligned around what is the hazard, what's the control, and is it going to be effective for us in this particular task, in this particular environment. So the move away from the standard 18 pages, 30 pages swim that sits there, it might be 2 or 3 years old, and bringing that out, sign it off, and that obviously shouldn't be done, right? So we're moving towards now the manual one, so let's start with a clean sheet, work our way through and make sure everyone is clearly aligned with what their task is, their skills, their competencies for the task at hand.
I think Clint makes a really good point. Like, it's there. So the thing is that swim's often worth something to hide behind. Like, and I think that was the thing. Let's make sure we got that swim, so nothing. If anything goes wrong, we're covered, type thing. Yeah. And I think that's where Clint is absolutely correct, right? If you take that greater shift of the role of safety, right, to being a coach and facilitator of better practices, right. So the key with swims is they need to be fit for purpose to help people navigate a job and manage risk, right? And so, whatever form they take, they just have to be, influenced by the team that do the work. So all the ones at Unity Water, Ben Ingram and the safety operations guys, they got them all redone with the team, basically. So the team members at Unity Water saying, like, we don't find that they're cumbersome, they're not really helpful. So we basically said, okay, let's redo them all with you guys. So we did that, and now it's about how do you build them into your risk assessment and job planning process, or it's something to go to if something changes in the job, right? You might go there. And so to us, it's this vision about them being, on your handheld asset device or whatever, where you can go back to that swim and, in an ideal world, you'd almost have instructional sort of stuff on there as well and things like that. So, they're as sophisticated as what you can make them, but they should be developed by the people who do the work, and they should be, to Clint's point, simple and accessible. Yeah.
Great. Just, we've only got a few minutes left, so I think this last question's an important one to ask for a lot of people who are trying to influence change within their organisation. So Frank has asked, how do you, if you're within an organisation that's more focused on traditional safety drivers, how do you start the conversation to look more broadly at culture, to look at the role of leadership, to look at the role of some of the items that we've spoken about? Because it sounds like, and we come across this a bit, it is a shift, right? It's a shift from, we're going to focus on lost time injury frequency rates and driving compliance to actually engaging and enlisting people in safety. So you're trying to cascade or roll that up to your executive. How do you tackle that?
Maybe Andrew, you guys are on that journey.
Yeah, look, it's a hard one to answer quickly, but I think the business has to want to change, and if it's not wanting to change, then you have to paint a picture as to what good looks like if you're not in a business that looks good. So how you do that's really important, and I think businesses have the opportunity to access a lot of data and a lot of information, so they've got to make sure it's credible, and I think it is a slow burn. And otherwise, you have a conversation with the CEO and you point out that what it could look like versus what it is at the moment and what it means to them.
Yes.
Right? So I think there's nothing more powerful than a CEO and an executive that's actually aligned, trying to improve the culture in a business, which will inadvertently and not without, deliberate change the safety culture as well. So I think it's a conversation by conversation. You have to have a clearer picture of where you want to go. And don't take no for an answer. It's an easy thing to sort of sit back and say I've tried, but my question would be, have you really tried?
Right. So persistence and continuing to drive the conversation and looking for the value drivers throughout.
And I guess sorry, Clint, you go.
I was just going to say that we're moving through that journey as well. And what we did was look at our historical data. You said we've got so much data, and I was able to present to our executive to say, well, nothing's changed. Right? So we're still continuing to injure people. We've been focused on LTIFR, we've been focused on all this other stuff, but nothing's changing.
Yeah.
So we need to change.
Yeah.
And hence now we've moved to all leading indicators in terms of our performance, and that's what the Xcode just look at.
Yeah.
You know, and so then obviously then that filters down. So I use the back data just to prove that nothing's changed. We're not getting better. So we need to do something different.
Yeah, okay, excellent.
Yeah, and that'd be my advice to Frank as well, is seek to get some information under the hood. Like, you know, so for us it was that frustration about doing all the things in the practice and the environment side that we thought were right, not being able to stop hurting people, and basically, you know, saying to our customers that we care about you, our team should have the same experience. So like getting in underneath, which told us, in fact, there was some issues around fear, blame and trust. Yeah.
Great. Well, look, gentlemen, thank you so much for what have been some really useful and practical insights into this data. We really are grateful for your time, as I'm sure our listeners and watchers are as well. So again, encourage you all to share this video with anyone that may be interested. A couple of other wrap-up points. If you're interested in furthering the conversation, we've got an opportunity for C-suite and executives to join us for a 90-minute session, driving safety to protect brand and reduce risk. If you're interested in that, please register your interest in the poll that we're about to put up. And we will have another webinar coming up very shortly with focusing on beyond TRIFR. So again, leveraging off what you're just talking about, Clint, how do you start to shift from a lag to a lead indicator focus and sell that benefit to the board? So if you are interested in registering your interest for that poll, we'll put the poll up now, Christy. And just as, and again, thank you again, gentlemen, for your time and effort and energy. We can go enjoy an almond croissant together, and hopefully don't have to swim home.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.